Have you guys heard of the axe-wielding man in a bunny costume who hunted in Burke, Virginia in 1970? Let's talk about it. A Fairfax County Public Library historian and activist, Brian A. Conley, extensively researched the Bunny Man legend. He had located two incidents of a man in a rabbit costume who threatened people with an axe. The vandalism reports occurred 10 days apart in 1970 in Burke, Virginia. The first incident was reported on the evening of October 19, 1970, by an Air Force Academy cadet, Robert Bennett, and his fiancée, who were visiting relatives in Guinea Road in Burke. Around midnight, while returning from a football game, they reportedly parked their car in a field on Guinea Road to, quote, visit an uncle who lived across the street from where the car was parked, end quote. As they sat in the front seat with the motor running, they noticed something moving outside the rear window. Moments later, a, quote, man dressed in a white suit with long bunny ears, end quote, ran out from nearby bushes and shouted, quote, you're on private property and have your tag number, end quote. The man then threw a hatchet through the passenger side window of the vehicle before running away. Bennett and his fiancée fled the scene uninjured, the hatchet still laying on the floorboard of their car. When local police requested a description of the man, Bennett insisted he was wearing a white suit with long bunny ears. But Bennett's fiancée contested that their assailant did not have bunny ears on his head, but was wearing a white cabaret of some sort. They both remembered seeing his face clearly, but in the darkness they could not determine his race. The police also obtained and examined the hatchet, but with no supporting clues or leads, ultimately returned it to Bennett. The investigation yielded no further, and the case was eventually closed altogether. The second report sighting occurred in the evening of October 31st, 1970, when construction security guard Paul Phillips approached a man standing on the porch of an unfinished and unoccupied home in Kings Park West on Guinea Road. Phillips said that the man was wearing a gray, black, and white bunny costume and was about 20 years old, 5 feet 8 inches, and weighed about 175 pounds. Phillips said in a statement, quote, I started talking to him, and that's when he started chopping, end quote. The man began chopping at a porch post with a long-handled axe, with some reports saying 8 gashes were stuck into the pole. The bunny man said, quote, all you people trespass around here, end quote, and, quote, you're trespassing. If you come any closer, I'll chop off your head, end quote. Phillips then left the house to retrieve his handgun from his car. By the time he returned, the bunny man had run off into the woods. There was no significant leads that emerged from this incident either, and the Fairfax County Police eventually handed the case over to W.L. Johnson of the Criminal Investigation Bureau. In the following weeks following the incident, more than 50 people contacted the police claiming to have seen the Bunny Man. Several newspapers, including the Washington Post, reported that the Bunny Man had eaten a man's runaway cat. Many people also called Johnson, claiming to have information about the whereabouts or identity of the Bunny Man. Though most amounted to prank calls or schoolhouse rumors, Johnson allegedly received a phone call from a construction worker in the subdivision where the Bunny Man was last seen. The worker stated that he was called by someone referring to themselves as the Axeman, who said, quote, you have been messing up my property by dumping tree stumps, limbs, and brush and other things on the property. You can make everything right by meeting me tonight and talk about the situation, end quote. Local authorities began a stakeout on the location, but the Axeman never failed to show up. The Post articles that mentioned this incident were, quote, Bunny Man in a suit sought in Fairfax, end quote. The Bunny Man reappears. Bunny Man strikes again. Bunny Man seen. Bunny reports are multiplying. In 1973, Patricia Johnson, a student at the University of Maryland College Park, documented the growing legend in a research paper that identified 53 versions of the Bunny Man story. While most accounts shared the same basic premise, they often differed in key details, including the location, the subsequent events, and the identity of those involved. Some versions went further, portraying the Bunny Man as a serial killer responsible for multiple murders, a claim that bears no resemblance to the two documented incidents that gave rise to the legend. By excluding routine domestic homicides and focusing instead on multiple victim cases and crimes involving children, both of which were relatively common at the time, investigators narrowed a list of more than 500 potential incidents to just 3 cases that closely matched the available evidence, if this version is true. To narrow the search for possible historical crimes connected to the legend, researchers focused on 3 particularly shocking cases that involved multiple victims or children. 1. Francis and June Hobler. On February 24, 1949, 37-year-old Frances Hobler traveled from Washington, D.C. to Fairfax County with her estranged husband, Charles Hobler, and their 8-month-old daughter, June. According to Charles, they had visited a nudist colony where he was a member to see a newly constructed lodge. After leaving the property, the vehicle became stuck in the mud. Charles later told investigators that an argument followed, after which Francis took the baby and walked away. He claimed he never saw them again. After spending the night in the stranded vehicle, Charles returned to Washington and came back the following day with relatives to retrieve the car. Only then were police notified that Francis and June were missing. A large search party involving Fairfax County Police, Washington detectives, and local volunteers began immediately. Late that afternoon, investigators noticed unusually soft ground near the lodge. Buried in a shallow grave less than 200 yards from the stranded vehicle were the bodies of Frances and her infant daughter. The investigation determined that Frances had been beaten and fatally shot, while June had been buried alive. The brutal nature of the crime shocked the Fairfax community. Charles Hobler quickly became the primary suspect. He eventually confessed, telling investigators he had planned the murders for several weeks, and he had only reported his family's disappearance after his original plan was disrupted when his car became stuck. In January 1950, a jury convicted Hobler and sentenced him to death. However, the Virginia Supreme Court later overturned the conviction, ruling that issues surrounding his mental state had not been properly considered. Hobler was subsequently committed to Western State Hospital after being declared legally insane. Minnie Loretta and Catherine Ridgway. One of Fairfax County's most notorious crimes occurred on March 4, 1927. That morning, Louis Boasberg arrived at the Ridgway family home on Telegraph Road, claiming he wished to speak with the family's patriarch. When he learned Mr. Ridgway was not home, he attacked Minnie Ridgway and her daughters, Loretta, age 7, and Catherine, age 5, before stealing money from the residence. The victims were discovered by a neighbor who heard cries coming from inside the home. All three were rushed to the hospital. Minnie survived and later identified Boasberg as the attacker, but both children died from their injuries. Boasberg was arrested shortly afterwards and moved to a jail in Winchester for his own protection. Following his conviction, he was executed on July 7, 1927, only a few months after the murders. Ava Roy. In August 1918, 14-year-old Ava Roy disappeared after leaving her family's farm near Burke, Virginia, to tend to the family's cattle. When she failed to return home that evening, her father organized a search with the neighbors. Approximately 1 day later, Ava's body was discovered in a wooded area near the O'Haines house. The county coroner concluded that she had been sexually assaulted before being strangled. A coroner's jury ruled that she had been murdered by an unknown person, but identified local woodcutter Lou Hall as the most likely suspect because he had been seen in the area around the time of Ava's disappearance. Despite the initial suspicion, investigators later identified additional suspects, and no one was ever successfully prosecuted for the murder. The case remains unsolved. The investigation produced several suspects, but none could be conclusively linked to Ava Roy's murder. The first suspect was William Wooster, a 16-year-old who had recently been released from a psychiatric institution after being arrested in an unrelated assault case. Investigators quickly determined that he had not been near the scene of Ava's murder and ruled him out. Attention then shifted to an unnamed Army sergeant who had deserted from Camp A. Humphreys, now Fort Belvoir. When he was apprehended near Charlottesville, Virginia, investigators noticed scratches on his face and hands, freshly laundered clothing, and it is claimed that he could not remember the events between leaving the camp and his arrest. After several weeks of investigation, however, authorities concluded he was not involved. The most dramatic development came in September 1918 with the arrest of Ben Rubin, an escape inmate from Loren Prison. After being taken to custody in Washington, D.C. on unrelated charges, Rubin confessed to killing Ava Roy. He claimed that he had encountered her while she was tending to her family's cattle and strangled her during an argument. Investigators remained skeptical of his confession. When Rubin was taken to the crime scene, he was unable to identify key locations or accurately describe where Ava's body had been found. He then withdrew his confession. Authorities later learned that Rubin had fabricated the story in hopes of being transferred to the Fairfax jail, believing it would provide better opportunity to escape. His plan briefly succeeded. He escaped from the Fairfax jail before being recaptured 2 days later. He was later convicted of burglary and escape, receiving an additional prison sentence. Meanwhile, Lou Hall, who had been an early suspect because he was seen later in the area around the time of the murder, was brought to trial. His first trial ended with a hung jury, voting 9 to 3 in favor of conviction. At his second trial, however, the jury sentenced to a verdict of not guilty. Despite years of investigation and multiple suspects, no one was ever convicted of Ava Roy's murder. Peter Roy, Ava's father, died in 1938 and was buried beside his youngest daughter at Lee Chapel Cemetery. More than a century later, Ava Roy's killer remains unknown. Folklorist Jan Harold Brunevard and historian Bray A. Conley have pointed to these involving stories as an example of how urban legends change over time. Conley argued that the Bunny Man tale gradually transformed through repeated retellings before reaching to an even wider audience during the early years of the internet. When new variations spread rapidly and further blurred the line between fact and folklore, Conley noted that the version of the Bunny Man legend that gained the most widespread attention first appeared on the website Castle of Spirits in 1999. In the post, a user identified himself as Timothy J. Forbes, claiming that the Bunny Man was an escaped convict named Douglas J. Griffin, who allegedly fled while being transported by a bus to a new prison in 1904. When the story went to describe a series of gruesome and seemingly supernatural murders at the Bunny Man Bridge, of which were said to have occurred decades before the two documented Bunny Man incidents of 1970. However, Conley's research found that every major claim in the online account was fabricated. There is no historical record of an escaped convict named Douglas J. Griffin. However, none of the alleged murders ever occurred, and several locations cited as sources, including the purported Old Clifton Library, never actually existed. According to Conley, the story is a work of fiction that became widely accepted as fact through repeated sharing online, helping transform the Bunny Man into one of America's most enduring urban legends.